Imagine this. Your parents drop six figures on a dream house for your flaky little sister, the one who bounces from job to job like a bad check, while you've been the invisible glue holding their retirement together, paying the utilities, the meds, the mortgage they pretend doesn't exist. They toast her new keys at dinner, and when you finally speak up, they pat your hand like you're the whiny kid still asking for allowance. But what if that one signature on a dusty old paper could flip the whole damn script, making them see who's been footing the real bill all along? Stick around, because this story's just getting started, and trust me, the payback's sweeter than you think. I still remember the day like it was yesterday, that crisp fall afternoon in our sleepy Ohio neighborhood where the leaves turn gold, but the family drama stays evergreen. The kind of place where everyone knows your business, but pretends they don't while sipping coffee on front porches that hide all sorts of resentments brewing just beneath the surface. I'm Sarah Jenkins, 42 years old, the reliable one who crunches numbers for a living as an accountant at a mid-sized firm in downtown Columbus, where I spend my days balancing ledgers that make sense on paper but never quite add up in real life. Especially when it comes to my own family, the ones I've been propping up financially for what feels like forever without so much as a thank you note or a shared burden. My folks, Tom and Evelyn Jenkins, both pushing 75 now with Dad's once strong hands trembling from years of manual labor in his old hardware days and Mom's joints aching from arthritis that flares up worse than the summer humidity, had called a big family dinner at their place. The same ranch-style house on Elm Street that I've been quietly chipping away at the mortgage payments for since Dad's pension from the mill dried up 5 years back after the plant closed and left half the town scrambling for work that paid half as much. I figured it was just another one of those obligatory gatherings where they'd grill me about my single life in my modest condo overlooking the Scioto River or wonder why I hadn't climbed higher up the corporate ladder despite pulling double shifts to cover their shortfalls, but no, they had news that hit me like a freight train barreling through the quiet tracks of my expectations, shattering the fragile peace I'd built around being the dependable daughter who never asked for much. Lisa, my younger sister by 8 years and the perpetual wild card in our deck, waltzes in late as usual with her artsy skirts swirling around her legs like she's stepped out of one of those bohemian catalogs Mom subscribes to. Her perpetual grin plastered on her face as if life's one endless canvas she gets to paint without ever having to clean up the mess or worry about the cost of the supplies, even though at 34 she's still chasing those elusive gallery dreams in Cleveland while crashing on friends' couches or picking up odd gigs that vanish faster than morning fog. She's always been the favorite, the one Mom and Dad dote on with stories of her artistic spirit that excuses every bounce check or unfinished project. And they eat it up like she's the prodigal daughter returned not just with fatted calf, but with a whole herd of golden opportunities they feel compelled to provide, turning a blind eye to how her creativity often leaves chaos in its wake. Turns out they'd bought her a house, a cute 2-bedroom Craftsman in an up-and-coming suburb just outside Akron, full price with no loan hassles or down payment scraped from her sporadic earnings. A place with a white picket fence and a backyard big enough for the garden she's always talked about but never planted, and Mom cooed over her like it was the most natural thing in the world, hugging Lisa tightly while Dad beamed with that proud papa pride about how it was their way of saying thanks for all her creativity that supposedly brightened their lives even as it drained their resources in ways they never acknowledged. Stability, they called it, as if Lisa's version of stability involved anything more than a freelance illustration job that lasted longer than a week or a string of boyfriends who promised the world but delivered nothing but more excuses. And here they were handing her equity on a silver platter wrapped in the kind of financial security I'd only dreamed of during those long nights, calculating how to stretch my salary to cover everyone's needs without letting my own slip too far. I'd been the one wiring them money every single month without fail, covering the electric bills when Dad's workshop hobbies involving old wiring and makeshift repairs shorted the grid and left the house in darkness during those brutal Midwest winters, footing the copays for Mom's arthritis medications that piled up like the autumn leaves in their yard, each prescription a reminder of how her condition worsened with every ignored doctor's visit because they couldn't afford the follow-ups until I stepped in. Hell, just last year I had quietly refinanced their mortgage with the bank, negotiating lower rates and extending the term because they couldn't swing the escalating payments anymore amid the rising costs of everything from groceries to gas. All while Lisa sent nothing but postcards from her so-called inspirational road trips across the Rust Belt, capturing sunsets and street art that looked pretty in photos, but did nothing to balance the books back home. But did they mention any of that during the toast, or even glance my way with a nod of appreciation for the daughter who'd kept their lights on and their fridge stocked through sheer grit and overtime? Nope, not a word, just empty plates and forced smiles as the conversation swirled around Lisa's new kitchen with its granite counters and stainless appliances that she'd probably never use for more than microwaving takeout. When I finally cleared my throat amid the clinking glasses and asked, point blank in that steady voice I'd honed from years of client meetings, why there was no such gesture for the daughter who'd essentially been their financial safety net for over a decade, Dad waved it off with a gruff chuckle, his calloused hand patting the table as if to dismiss the whole inquiry. Sarah, you're set with your career and that nice condo of yours overlooking the river. You don't need a boost like Lisa does, she's just getting started, he said, while Mom nodded along vigorously, adding that I was always so independent and self-sufficient, as if it were some kind of curse or character flaw instead of the backbone I'd forged from scratch after their messy divorce in the 90s that left us kids fending for ourselves while they rebuilt their lives on shaky ground. The table fell into that awkward quiet after my question hung there unanswered, forks scraping against plates in the heavy silence broken only by the hum of the old refrigerator in the background. Lisa avoiding my eyes as she gushed about potential paint colors for her new living room walls, describing shades of teal and mustard that sounded more like a headache waiting to happen than a home. I forced a laugh then, the kind that's more bitter than genuinely amused, bubbling up from that deep well of resentment I'd kept capped for so long, thinking about how I'd slaved through night shifts right after community college, taking on extra accounting gigs to help them rebound from the divorce fallout that had them drowning in legal fees and lost income, only to remain the reliable shadow in the family photo, always there but never in the spotlight. As dinner wound down with dessert that tasted like cardboard in my mouth, I helped clear the dishes out of habit, stacking plates in the sink. While my mind raced with that old familiar ache twisting in my gut, the one that whispers you're loved, sure, in the abstract way parents love all their kids, but only valued as the utility player who fixes problems without fanfare or reciprocity. The one who pays the bills so others can play house. Driving home that night through the winding streets lined with glowing porch lights and families settling in for the evening, the radio droning some classic rock tune about family ties that bind too tight and sometimes strangle. I pulled into my garage with a sigh and rummaged through a dusty box of old family papers I'd stored on the shelves there, the kind of clutter that accumulates from years of being the keeper of records no one else wants to touch. Tucked between faded tax forms from the early 2000s and yellowed insurance policies was this power of attorney document from a decade ago, the one I'd signed in a hospital waiting room when Dad's health scare with his heart had us all panicking about who would handle the finances if things went south, granting me broad control over their assets and decisions in emergencies, without any real discussion about what that power might mean down the line. It wasn't just any old paper. Staring at it under the dim garage bulb, the fine print blurring slightly in the low light, my heart skipped a beat as possibilities flickered like faulty wiring. What if I dusted it off now, after all these years of quiet sacrifice, and used it to remind them exactly who held the strings? But as that thought settled in, heavy with the weight of potential fallout, my phone buzzed sharply on the workbench. Lisa, of all people, texting about housewarming party ideas and how she couldn't wait to show me the place, oblivious to the storm she was stirring. Little did I know, that innocent message was just the tip of a much deeper mess she was dragging the whole family into, one that would force choices I never imagined making. Waking up the next morning with that power of attorney document still burning a metaphorical hole in my desk drawer felt like holding onto a loaded deck of cards in a high-stakes family poker game I hadn't even chosen to sit down for. The kind where the pot includes years of unspoken resentments and the risk of calling bluffs that could topple everything built on shaky assumptions about who owes what to whom in the tangled web of sibling and parental obligations. I tried to shake off the temptation at first, brewing my coffee strong and black in the quiet of my kitchen while the early light filtered through the blinds onto the counter cluttered with unopened mail from work, telling myself over and over that Sarah, don't be petty or vengeful because you're supposed to be the mature one here, the adult daughter who steps up without keeping score even when the scoreboard has been lopsided for 2 decades straight since the divorce scattered our priorities. Like loose change. But pettiness has a sneaky way of creeping in through the cracks when you've been functioning as the family's unofficial ATM machine for so long, dispensing cash and coverage without ever receiving a thank you slip or even a casual acknowledgement that your sacrifices were noticed amid the daily grind of balancing your own career demands with their endless emergencies. Work dragged on endlessly that day in the fluorescent-lit office, where spreadsheets blurred together on my screen as I replayed the dinner scene in my mind like a looped surveillance tape. Dad's casual dismissal of my question stinging worse than a fresh paper cut from all those stacks of bills I'd personally paid and filed away without complaint. Each one a quiet testament to the role I'd assumed after college when Lisa was still dreaming big and I was just trying to keep the lights on for everyone else. By the time lunch rolled around with its hurried sandwich from the deli downstairs, I caved to the nagging curiosity and called Mom on my cell, keeping my tone casual and light as if I were just checking in on the weather rather than probing for the financial underbelly of their grand gesture toward Lisa, asking how the house closing had gone with all its paperwork and handshakes that sealed her fate into something resembling adulthood. She gushed without hesitation about the realtor, some slick hotshot from the Akron area who promised Lisa the moon with comps and market trends that made the purchase sound like the steal of the century. But when I gently steered the conversation toward the funding details, how exactly they had swung the full price tag without dipping too deep into their limited retirement nest egg, she hemmed and hawed with that evasive lilt she gets whenever money talk veers too close to reality, finally, muttering something about your father's savings covering the bulk and a little loan from the bank to bridge the gap without specifying the terms or the interest rates that always seem to multiply problems down the line. A little loan, I thought with a skeptical raise of my eyebrow visible only to my reflection in the office window, because I knew their savings account like the back of my hand from years of monitoring statements to ensure they didn't bounce checks on essentials. And it was barely padded enough for a month's groceries, let alone a 6-figure down payment, especially after the roof leak I had covered last spring when the insurance dragged its feet and left them staring at water damage that could have turned into mold if I hadn't wired the funds immediately. That evening, after the commute home through rush-hour traffic that amplified my growing frustration like echoes in a canyon, I drove over to their place under the pretense of dropping off some leftover casserole from my own fridge, a neighborly excuse that masked my real intent to casually glance at the ever-growing stack of mail on the kitchen counter, the one that always spills family secrets through envelopes marked urgent or past due when no one's paying close enough attention to sort it properly. Sure enough, while Mom was fussing with the oven mitts and Dad stepped out back to tinker with his old grill that sputtered more smoke than heat these days, I managed to snap a few discreet photos of the top papers with my phone, including a forwarded bank statement addressed to Lisa's shiny new house number that caught my eye because it wasn't in their usual pile but seemed freshly arrived from the mortgage company. Back in my condo that night, scrolling through the images on my laptop, with a glass of red wine to steady my nerves, my jaw practically hit the keyboard as the numbers unfolded like a bad plot twist in one of those financial thrillers you watch on streaming services late at night, revealing that Lisa hadn't just scored a free ride on the parental generosity train, but had already racked up a ballooning mortgage payment she could barely touch with her erratic income, compounded by credit card debts for so-called renovations that started pouring in before she even unpacked her first box, furniture deliveries from big box stores, fancy light fixtures ordered online, even landscaping services for a yard she hadn't seen yet, all charged with the optimistic flair that defined her approach to life, but ignored the practicalities of cash flow. Turns out, In a detail that made my stomach twist with a mix of anger and dark amusement, Mom and Dad had co-signed the mortgage without a second thought, convinced that Lisa's burgeoning art side hustle, with its sporadic commissions and online sales, would magically cover the monthly hits, turning what should have been a clean gift into a shared liability that looped back around to their already strained finances like a boomerang they never saw coming. What a load of optimistic nonsense, I chuckled to myself in the dim light of my living room, the sound echoing hollowly as I pictured Lisa's creativity painting them all into increasingly tight corners with every impulsive purchase. Her dream home morphing into a debt trap disguised as stability, while I sat there holding the evidence that could either expose the cracks or widen them irreparably. The real kicker landed a few days later when Dad called mid-afternoon during a rare quiet moment at work, his voice gruff and laced with that familiar undertone of reluctance, as he asked if I could spot them for the next utility bill that had crept up unexpectedly due to some seasonal surge in usage from his workshop experiments and Mom's increased reliance on the air conditioning for her joints. I paused longer than usual this time, that power of attorney flashing in my mind like a warning light on a dashboard, and for the first time in years, I uttered a firm no, not in anger, but with a steady resolve that surprised even me, suggesting instead that maybe they talk to Lisa about chipping in from her new setup now that she had equity to leverage or at least a fresh start to build on. He sputtered on the line, calling it just a temporary hiccup in their budget, but I hung up feeling a twisted thrill course through me like the first sip of something forbidden, realizing this was my initial little jab at revenge. Witty in its understated simplicity, by forcing them to feel the pinch I'd endured silently for so long without raising my voice or making a scene. But revenge, as it turns out, has a funny way of snowballing once you give it a nudge, gathering momentum like a snowball rolling downhill through the uncertainties of family dynamics that no one ever prepares you for in those hallmark moments we all pretend define us. That very weekend, as the leaves finished their colorful descent outside my window and the air turned crisp with the promise of shorter days, Lisa showed up at my door completely unannounced, her eyes wide and stripped of their usual sparkle, carrying a bottle of cheap wine clutched like a peace offering in her trembling hands, while she mumbled something about needing my advice on settling into the house before the realities caught up. Stepping inside with that hesitant grace she reserves for when her charm alone won't suffice, she spilled the details over our impromptu glasses on the couch, admitting how the house payments were already creeping up faster than anticipated with hidden fees from the HOA and property taxes that the realtor had glossed over, and how Mom and Dad were starting to stress in ways she'd never seen, their easy indulgence toward her cracking under the weight of numbers they couldn't ignore anymore. It hit me then, listening to her unravel the threads of what was supposed to be her big win, that there was far more to this so-called gift than any of us had bargained for on the surface, especially when she mentioned offhand in her rambling explanation how the deed carried some fine print about shared liabilities that extended beyond the obvious, tying back to older family entanglements none of us had discussed in years. Suddenly, my dusty power of attorney didn't seem like such an outdated relic anymore, its clauses glowing with potential leverage I hadn't fully grasped until that moment. But before I could press her for more specifics on what those liabilities might entail, she dropped the real bomb that left me reeling, her voice dropping to a whisper as she revealed that the house wasn't entirely hers in the clear sense because of a lingering lien from an old investor Dad had roped into one of his long-forgotten business deals from the 80s. A shadowy obligation that could potentially drag the entire family down into legal and financial quicksand if it ever fully surfaced in the light of day. Lisa's confession lingered in the air of my living room that night like the stubborn smoke from a backyard barbecue that refuses to dissipate even after the coals have died down, thick and choking with implications that wrapped around us both as she paced back and forth across the worn rug, twisting the stem of her wine glass in her fingers while her usual confident facade cracked under the pressure of admissions she probably never intended to make to the one person who'd always been the straight arrow in the family. I kept my expression carefully neutral, nodding along with what seemed like supportive interest while inside my mind the gears turned faster than the relentless tick of a deadline on a major audit at work, Processing every detail she let slip about how that mystery lien on the house tied directly back to Dad's dusty business ventures from the 80s when he was still chasing the American dream through a hardware store that promised steady income but delivered nothing but headaches and unpaid suppliers in the end. Here was my little sister, the golden child who'd always landed on her feet no matter how high she jumped or how recklessly she spent, now admitting in hushed tones that the shiny new house they had gifted her was far more like a gilded cage than the freedom she had imagined, with that lingering obligation from the old investor acting as the bars that could close in tighter if not handled with care. A debt that had been buried under layers of optimism and denial, but was now resurfacing like weeds through cracked concrete after years of neglect. She whined softly about how she had thought the deal was clean and straightforward when the realtor handed over the keys, but the lawyer's mention of contingencies during the closing had planted seeds of doubt that were now sprouting into full-blown panic, especially since those fine print details looped the liability back to the family accounts in ways that could affect more than just her fresh start. I bit back the laugh that bubbled up unbidden, a dark chuckle at the irony of her boost turning into everyone's burden. Thinking how her artistic spirit that Mom and Dad celebrated so freely always seemed to overlook the practical math of consequences until someone like me had to step in and balance the equation. But instead of spilling my own secrets about the power of attorney tucked away, I played the role of the understanding big sister, suggesting gently that she consult a financial advisor or even loop in a trusted family friend who knew the ropes, all while mentally mapping out how this revelation could shift the entire family ledger in directions that favored the one who'd been carrying the load for far too long without complaint. The backlash from my small act of defiance came quicker than a summer storm rolling in over the Ohio plains, catching everyone off guard with its sudden fury as Mom called me just a couple of days later during my lunch break at the office, her voice a tangled mix of lingering guilt from the dinner confrontation and the gritty determination that had always defined her approach to tough spots since the divorce days when she juggled 2 jobs to keep the roof over our heads. She begged over the phone line that crackled slightly from her spotty cell service at home, pleading for me to cover an emergency car repair for Dad whose tires had worn down to nothing from his daily ritual drives out to check on Lisa's new place and tinker with whatever caught his eye along the way, framing it as a one-time favor that wouldn't strain anyone's budget, but really just another in the endless string of requests I'd fielded over the years. "You're so good with money, Sarah," she added with that tone that sounded like a compliment on the surface, but carried the weight of an expectation I'd grown accustomed to fulfilling, like it was my inherent duty as the practical daughter to swoop in whenever their fixed income hit a snag. Whether it was medical copays stacking up or unexpected home repairs that popped up like whack-a-moles in their aging ranch house, I felt that familiar pull in my chest, the one that had tugged me into wiring funds at 2 in the morning during Dad's health scares or refinancing loans when rates spiked. But this time around I twisted the knife just a bit with a touch of humor to soften the blow, replying calmly that Mom should tell Dad to carpool with Lisa now that she had her own reliable wheels and a house close enough for shared errands, or perhaps sell off one of those fancy gadgets from the new kitchen that Lisa probably wasn't using anyway since her cooking habits leaned more toward takeout than home-cooked meals. She gasped audibly on the other end, calling my suggestion selfish in a way that stung because it echoed the independence Dad had thrown at me during dinner, but I hung up with a smirk playing on my lips that no one could see, savoring the satisfaction of drawing my first real boundary after years of blurred lines, a clever redirection of their reliance that enforced consequences without escalating into a full-blown argument or ugly accusations flying across the table. But dilemmas always seem to pile on like unpaid invoices left too long on the desk, gathering interest and urgency until they demand attention in the most inconvenient moments. And this one materialized in the form of a casual family lunch that Mom orchestrated at Lisa's new digs under the guise of neutral ground to celebrate the fresh chapter, while smoothing over the lingering tensions from my refusal to play financier on demand. Walking through the front door into the space that still smelled of fresh paint and unpacked boxes, The place screamed Lisa's organized chaos, with half-empty moving crates stacked in corners alongside her abstract canvases leaning precariously against walls, and a kitchen island buried under a landslide of takeout containers from her first week's solo living that hinted at habits unchanged despite the upgrade in address. Dad clapped me on the back with an awkward firmness that spoke volumes about his discomfort with the unspoken rift, muttering something about how we all needed to pull together now that things were settling into a new normal, with Lisa's house as the anchor point for family gatherings moving forward. While Mom bustled around setting the table with mismatched plates that she had brought from home to make it feel more lived in. Settling into this supposed harmony felt anything but natural, especially as Lisa shot me a desperate sideways glance across the spread of cold cuts and potato salad, her foot nudging mine under the table in that old signal from our childhood days when we'd cover for each other's small rebellions against parental rules. A silent plea that carried the weight of her earlier confession about the lean without drawing attention from the others. Midway through the meal, as Mom passed around the bowl of creamy potatoes that reminded me of holiday dinners from better times, Dad cleared his throat with that gravelly rumble he gets when broaching serious topics and slid a manila folder my way across the checkered tablecloth, announcing in his no-nonsense tone that we needed me to sign this addendum right then and there as a formality for the house transfer paperwork. Something about granting powers over the joint accounts in case Lisa hit a rough patch with her payments and required backup from the family pool of resources. My pulse quickened like a heartbeat under scrutiny as I flipped open the folder under the watchful eyes of everyone around the table, spotting the dense clauses that would loop me even deeper into the financial web by making me the designated fallback for Lisa's mounting obligations, potentially diluting the authority from my old power of attorney if I committed without reading between the lines on how it all interconnected with the hidden lien she had mentioned. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, expectant and heavy with the assumption that I'd comply as always, the reliable Sarah who fixed things without fuss, but I smiled lightly instead, pen hovering but not touching paper, and tucked the document into my purse with a casual remark about needing to read it over thoroughly at home where I could consult my own notes and ensure nothing got overlooked in the rush. Their faces shifted in that moment from relief to confusion brewing into something sharper and more accusatory. Mom's brow furrowing while Dad's jaw tightened visibly, the air thickening with unspoken questions about why the daughter, who always stepped up, was suddenly drawing lines in the sand. As the lunch wrapped up with strained small talk about the neighborhood and weather, I waved goodbye from the driveway with that unsigned paper burning a hole in my bag, feeling the thrill of control for the first time in ages. But Lisa pulled me aside just before I got into my car, whispering urgently that she'd call later with more details on the lien's origins and how it tied to Dad's past mistakes, her eyes pleading for alliance in the face of what was coming. Driving off into the afternoon sun that cast long shadows across the suburban streets, I couldn't shake the wonder gnawing at me about whether pushing back this hard against their expectations was truly crossing into unforgivable territory, or if the real storm of consequences was only just beginning to gather force on the horizon, ready to unleash a torrent that would test every bond we'd ever claimed to have. Holding on to that unsigned addendum felt like clutching a set of aces in a high-stakes poker game where the entire pot consisted of fractured family loyalties and the potential to call bluffs that had been building for decades under layers of denial and favoritism. A tense standoff that stretched across the following days as I pored over its clauses late into the nights with my laptop screen casting a cold glow on the walls of my condo, each word scrutinized for the ways it might entangle me further in the financial quicksand Lisa's house had become. As the uncertainty deepened with every unanswered call from Mom and Dad's house, I found myself delving deeper into the past through stacks of old records I'd kept in my filing cabinet. The kind of meticulous archiving that came naturally to an accountant, but now served as a reluctant excavation of memories I'd rather leave buried, triggering flashbacks that hit with the force of suppressed emotions long compartmentalized to keep the peace. I remembered vividly being 25 years old and fresh out of community college, with an associate's degree in accounting clutched like a lifeline. Juggling an entry-level job at a small firm where the pay barely covered my rent while Dad's sudden heart episode in the emergency room drained what little savings the family had left, turning their modest home into a revolving door of medical bills that piled up faster than the snowdrifts outside during that brutal winter. Mom had been a wreck back then, her eyes red-rimmed from nights spent worrying over statements that showed more red ink than black, crying quietly in the kitchen over how the divorce from a decade earlier had left them both vulnerable to every setback. And it was me who stepped up without hesitation, signing the power of attorney in that sterile hospital waiting room amid the beeps of monitors and the scent of antiseptic, granting myself broad oversight of their assets and decisions in case things worsened. Because Lisa was off at art school on scholarships and grants, lost in her dreams of exhibitions and creative freedom that seemed worlds away from the gritty reality of keeping the family afloat. Those early years blurred into a montage of overtime shifts at the office, followed by stops at the pharmacy for Mom's prescriptions and late-night calculations to refinance Dad's truck loan when his health kept him from working. All while Lisa sent occasional emails from campus about her latest project or boyfriend, untouched by the grind that forged my sense of duty into something unbreakable yet quietly resentful. A role I embraced out of love but now questioned in the quiet hours as the weight of it all pressed down harder than ever. The conflict escalated in ways that felt both inevitable and suffocating when Mom appeared unannounced at my office building one gray afternoon, her cardigan clutched tightly around her shoulders against the chill wind that whipped through the downtown streets. Her eyes red and puffy from what I could only assume were heated arguments at home over the unsigned paper and the growing whispers about the lien's implications on their retirement security. She suggested coffee in the break room with that pleading lilt in her voice that always surfaced during crises, detailing over steaming mugs how Dad had been pacing the floors at night like a caged animal, his worry about the old investor's claim manifesting in restless energy that kept everyone awake. A debt from his failed hardware store days in the 80s when he had borrowed from a shady contact to stock inventory during a recession that hit the Rust Belt hard and left small businesses like his drowning in unsold goods and mounting interest. She hinted delicately at Lisa's unwitting role in all this, confessing that my sister had known fragments about the investor tie-in from Dad's offhand stories, but had downplayed them to the realtor during the house hunt, convinced her charm and budding career would smooth over any wrinkles in the paperwork, turning what should have been a straightforward gift into a Pandora's box of liabilities that now threatened to upend the stability they had all sought. I felt a sharp pang in my chest then, a moral dilemma twisting like a knot because part of me disagreed with the rising tide of spite I harbored, wondering if clinging to this resentment was truly justified or if it was eroding the family bonds I'd fought so hard to preserve through years of unseen support. Yet another voice whispered that self-respect demanded more than endless sacrifice without reciprocity, especially when the favoritism had blinded them to my contributions. Humor cut through the heaviness like a rye. Aside in a tense meeting, as I quipped lightly that if Lisa's art couldn't pay the bills, maybe she could paint the investor a portrait flattering enough to forgive the debt, but Mom didn't crack a smile, her face crumpling as she begged me once more to sign the addendum and help them refinance the mess before it spiraled, her hand reaching across the small table to grasp mine in a gesture that carried the weight of our shared history from tougher times. Instead of yielding to the pull of obligation, I made my calculated move that evening after she left, contacting an old college buddy named Karen who'd gone on to become a sharp family law attorney in Columbus with a practice that specialized in estate tangles just like this one, looping her in anonymously over a secure email about the power of attorney and the lien's murky origins without revealing the full family drama to protect what privacy remained. She confirmed quickly what I'd suspected after cross-referencing the documents, explaining how the lien stemmed from a high-interest loan Dad had taken from an informal investor network back in the day, a deal that had soured when the store folded and left the debt compounding quietly in the background until Lisa's house purchase triggered a review that brought it roaring back to life with demands for repayment that could force a sale if not negotiated down. Her advice was gold, a sly countermove where I could invoke my existing power. of attorney to temporarily freeze certain joint transfers, buying precious time to expose the full extent of the financial rot to mom and dad without launching a direct attack that might shatter the fragile truce. All while redirecting discretionary funds from a shared account toward legitimate needs like mom's upcoming meds rather than Lisa's vanity projects. It was satisfying in a way that bordered on cathartic, that witty pivot of control which enforced accountability through paperwork rather than confrontation. A clever maneuver that left Dad fuming on the phone a day later when the bank notified him of the holds, accusing me of overstepping in a voice thick with betrayal, but I played it cool and factual, reminding him gently that it all aligned with the old documents he'd signed off on during his health scare, turning his indignation back on the very system he'd relied upon without question. The real twist unfolded at a strained family meeting they insisted on holding at a local diner that evening. The kind of no-frills spot with vinyl booths cracked from years of use and the comforting aroma of greasy fries and strong coffee that evoked simpler times before favors turned into fractures and expectations into resentments. Lisa arrived looking frazzled and uncharacteristically subdued, her hair tied back in a hasty ponytail as she slid into the booth and admitted haltingly over baskets of onion rings that she'd exaggerated her income projections to the realtor during the closing process, pulling the entire family deeper into the commitment with optimistic numbers from her freelance gigs that hadn't materialized as hoped, a confession that hung heavy amid the clatter of silverware and murmured conversations from nearby tables. Tempers began to flare as Dad recounted the investor's latest letter demanding a settlement, his voice rising in frustration while Mom dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, the air thick with the blame game that circled without landing until he shoved the addendum folder across the Formica table once more, his eyes locking on mine with a mix of desperation and defiance as he urged me to sign it right there for the sake of unity and to prevent the house from slipping away before Lisa could even settle in. My hand hovered over the pen that the waitress had provided with our check, heart pounding with the cumulative weight of years spent ignored and undervalued. The subtle clues I'd dropped throughout like breadcrumbs about old papers and hidden ledgers now converging into a pattern they couldn't ignore anymore, everyone leaning in with bated breath, Mom's silent plea etched in her furrowed brow, Dad's rigid posture screaming authority undermined, Lisa's fear palpable in her fidgeting fingers. One signature, I said softly into the charged silence, the words carrying the gravity of impending revelation, and everything changes in ways you never saw coming, the air crackling with uncertainty like static before a thunderstorm as I held their gazes, wondering if this moment of poised power would forge a new path or shatter the remnants of what we'd once called family beyond repair. That suspended moment in the diner booth stretched out like warm taffy pulled taut under the harsh fluorescent lights overhead, the pen feeling heavier than a stack of unpaid ledgers in my grip as the weight of all the unspoken truths and buried resentments pressed down on the table between us, turning the simple act of signing into a pivotal crossroads where family histories collided with the harsh arithmetic of accountability that none of us had fully faced until now. I signed the addendum with deliberate slowness, letting the ink spread across the page in a deliberate bloom that marked not just agreement, but a calculated assertion of the power I'd held quietly for years, slipping in a single clarifying line in the margin that referenced my original power of attorney from a decade earlier, the one granting me oversight of their assets in emergencies, a subtle notation that tied everything together without fanfare and ensured the document amplified rather than undermined my existing authority in the eyes of any lawyer who might review it later. No one noticed the addition at first in the rush of relief that washed over their faces, Dad exhaling a gruff thanks while clapping the folder shut as if closing the book on the tension, Mom reaching across to squeeze my hand with tears glistening in her eyes, and Lisa pulling me into an awkward side hug that carried the faint scent of her hurried perfume mixed with the diner's lingering fry grease, all of them assuming the signature sealed their escape from the lien's looming threat and restored the fragile unity they'd always taken for granted as the foundation of our bond. But as the meal wrapped up with cleared plates and a check divided unevenly because no one wanted to argue over pennies anymore, I slid photocopies of the key documents across the table, detailed bank statements showing years of my transfers, the investor's formal claim letter with its compounded interest figures, and a summary of the frozen joint. Accounts I'd enacted through my authority, watching realization dawn gradually like the slow reveal of a hidden clause in a contract, Mom's whisper breaking the stunned silence as she pieced it together that I'd been handling the bulk of their finances all along. From utility spikes to medical copays, and even the mortgage refinances that kept their home from foreclosure during Dad's rough patches. The revenge cascaded from there in a series of clever, interconnected maneuvers that unfolded without the need for raised voices or dramatic showdowns. My lawyer friend Karen drafting a formal letter to the investor under the umbrella of my power of attorney that negotiated the lien down to a manageable sum by highlighting the family's limited assets and proposing a structured payoff drawn from non-essential sources, but only after I'd quietly rerouted funds from the joint account that Lisa had been dipping into for her house renovations, those extravagant light fixtures and custom cabinets that screamed indulgence, toward the settlement directly, leaving her dream home structurally sound but stripped of the frivolous extras that had blinded everyone to the real costs involved. Dad's jaw dropped open when the bank confirmation arrived the next day via email, the notification spelling out in black and white how I could veto future cosigns or large withdrawals at my discretion, a revelation that forced him to confront the extent of his reliance on my unseen interventions during his health decline and business recoveries, while Mom broke down in a quiet phone call later that evening, admitting through sobs how they'd taken my steadiness for granted over the years, assuming it was an endless well of support rather than the product of my own sacrifices like skipped vacations and delayed personal goals to prioritize their needs. Lisa, cornered by the shifting dynamics and her own confessions at the diner, owned up fully in a tearful voicemail left while I was at work, explaining how she'd leaned into the favoritism as a crutch to mask her string of poor decisions from job hopping to impulsive spending, believing it positioned her as the family's success story when in reality it had only highlighted the imbalances that festered beneath the surface, a dynamic that now left her facing the unvarnished truth of needing to build her life without the safety net of preferential treatment. It was all satisfying in its witty precision, that orchestrated flip of the script which made them see not just that I paid the bills, but that I controlled the flow of them, a payback delivered through paperwork and policy rather than pettiness. And I couldn't resist lacing my response during a follow-up family call with a touch of dry humor by suggesting that next time they considered buying a house for someone, they might want to include the daughter who'd been covering the property taxes on their own for half a decade, a line that drew uneasy chuckles amid the awkward admissions, but underscored the point without descending into outright hostility. In the weeks that followed this climactic unraveling, the calls from home came more tentatively than before, Dad's voice softer on the line as he offered to start reimbursing some of the back amounts through small monthly checks drawn from his Social Security. A gesture that felt like the first real acknowledgement of my role even if it couldn't erase the years of oversight, while Mom floated the idea of family counseling sessions at a local center to unpack the favoritism and resentments that had built up like sediment in a riverbed, her tone hopeful yet laced with the fear that we'd drifted too far to fully reconnect. Lisa followed through on her promises with surprising determination, landing a steady part-time gig at a Cleveland design firm that utilized her artistic skills for graphic work and even contributing a modest share toward the remaining lien payments. Steps that hinted at growth born from necessity rather than inspiration, though her texts still carried that underlying plea for understanding, as if testing whether forgiveness came as easily as the old indulgences. But dilemmas lingered persistently in the quiet moments after hanging up, shadows that colored every interaction with ambiguity. Had signing that altered paper truly mended the fractures or merely illuminated them in stark relief, forcing a reevaluation that might heal or harden the divides depending on how we all navigated the aftermath. The lien settled quietly through the negotiations without forcing a house sale, preserving Lisa's fresh start while underscoring the fragility of the gifts we'd given and received, but family dinners at the old ranch house resumed with an undercurrent of caution. Conversations skirting deeper issues as if afraid to stir the pot again, leaving me to wonder during drives home through the familiar Ohio suburbs whether my revenge, as clever and justified as it felt in execution, had ultimately cost more in emotional currency than it gained in respect and equity. Pushing them to value my contributions had widened the gap I'd always sensed as the overlooked pillar, turning casual reliance into conscious effort, but also introducing a hesitancy that made warmth feel manufactured. And in those reflective evenings alone with a book or the hum of the city outside my window, I pondered the larger question hanging unresolved like a check in the mail. Was reconciliation truly possible after such a pointed reckoning? Or had I become the figure they now approached? With caution, the bill payer turned gatekeeper whose signature could build bridges or burn them down, leaving the future of our ties as open-ended as the balances we still carried forward.